Did Lewis Hamilton deserve a penalty in the Mexico Grand Prix? Now, yet again, we're discussing Lewis Hamilton and a penalty because yet again, the FIA are showing their corruption and showing that realistically, I don't think they understand their own rules. Now, obviously, when we're going to discuss this, we're going to look at turn one. We're also going to look at the opportunities that happened with Lewis Hamilton and Max Verstappen across the course of this video as well. And it's going to be very, very interesting to get your guys' take on it as well. So if you haven't done so already, hit that like button, hit that subscribe button, and turn on that notification bell. And let me know your thoughts down in the comments. Now, Lewis Hamilton spent the first 10 laps of the race in absolute anger after a lap one, turn one incident. But ultimately, it wasn't an incident which caused a lot of uproar in regards to the stewards room. Now, Lewis Hamilton had got ahead of Charles Leclerc. He'd also got ahead of Max Verstappen, and ultimately Max Verstappen and Charles Leclerc then ended up racing across the grass. Leclerc coming out in P1, Verstappen initially coming out ahead of Lewis Hamilton. Now, I have to give full respect to Verstappen. He did initially give that place back, but for Charles Leclerc, he only gave back the place to Lando Norris, which in my opinion is absolutely disgusting. Now, we're going to get into that in a lot more detail right now, so hit that like button, hit that subscribe button, let's get into it. Now, for me, Charles Leclerc had lost the position to Lewis Hamilton. Don't get me wrong, it was very close going into turn one, but Lewis Hamilton had it edged ahead. And Charles Leclerc took an escape road that he didn't need to take, and he could have stayed on the track, but ultimately that would have meant dropping down to P4. Now, the big problem with that for me is that Charles Leclerc knew for a fact that he was going to gain an advantage cutting across the grass. He wouldn't lose positions and all things like that. And ultimately, that's a situation that should have been dealt with in the stewards room quite early on. Now, in my opinion, I believe that a lot of these issues should have been solved by Ferrari themselves, but ultimately the FIA could have made a decision for them. Now, for me, if Charles Leclerc had have dropped the position for Lewis Hamilton, we wouldn't even be here discussing the penalty. Now, you can obviously give me your opinions on that lap one, turn one incident, but I think the rules have got to be changed for lap one, turn one, because ultimately, as Fernando Alonso said, you can just cut now. You can cut lap one, turn one because it's lap one, turn one. And ultimately, if someone goes and does that in the next race and gets penalised, they're going to have the argument of, well, what about Mexico? Because there was, what, 3 or 4 drivers that cut the grass and gained an advantage on lap one, turn one of Mexico, and nobody received a penalty. And that is where my frustration comes for me, because you look at that incident, and for me, Max Verstappen arguably should have had to drop back behind George Russell. I think it was George Russell behind Lewis Hamilton. Max Verstappen arguably should have done that, right? But Charles Leclerc should have dropped into P3. And ultimately, if that whole situation had been dealt with in a better manner, we would not be sat here having this discussion, because Lewis Hamilton would have been behind Lando Norris. It would have been Charles Leclerc and Max Verstappen going side by side. Well, in fact, it wouldn't have even been Charles Leclerc and Max Verstappen, because Max Verstappen would have been behind George Russell. So, for me, there's got to be a realistic discussion about the penalties, about the rules that are in place, because ultimately, they are fucking shit. And in my opinion, it can't go on like this, because at the end of the day, when you look at those sort of penalties and those sort of situations, what was it? 10 laps later, Lewis Hamilton gets a penalty for leaving the track and gaining a lasting advantage over Max Verstappen because he cut a little bit of grass on, was it turn 4? Didn't complete the runoff properly. Now, if he'd have completed the runoff properly, let's just acknowledge the fact that he probably smashes into Behrman, Verstappen and the 2 Mercedes drivers, because of the way that runoff works. The runoff there is absolutely ridiculous. Now, for me, there's an easy way to solve all these problems, and quite obviously, I don't believe that Lewis Hamilton should have received a penalty. The easiest way to solve these problems is where there's grass, put fucking gravel. Or put a fucking wall. Like, it's not difficult, is it? Put a wall, put gravel. What? No one's going there then. Max Verstappen would have been out the race for one. Charles Leclerc would have probably been out the race as well. So, I'm not being funny, right? If you put gravel in, you get rid of the grass, you put in gravel. Or you get rid of the grass, you put in a wall on the outside of turn 1, 2 and 3, right? What happens? Max Verstappen hits the wall. There's one. I think it was Fernando Alonso who cut a little bit as well. Also would have hit the wall. Charles Leclerc would have probably got stuck in the gravel or hit the wall. So there's 3 drivers that ultimately had a huge impact later down the line that would have been out the race. Now, I know Alonso didn't necessarily have an impact later down the line, obviously went on to retire in the pits, but Max Verstappen ended up finishing P3. Charles Leclerc ended up finishing P2, and both of those drivers, if there was a wall there, would have been out, or would have stayed on the track and lost positions. So ultimately, the lack of wall, the lack of gravel trap, ultimately made it so that Max Verstappen and Charles Leclerc could gain an advantage in those positions. We can even go and talk about turn 4, where Lewis Hamilton followed that runoff, because if there's gravel there, if there's a wall there, he doesn't take the runoff, he's probably out of the race. But ultimately, you'd already be looking at Max Verstappen being out of the race, so that instant never occurs in the first place. And Hamilton is pretty much free reign in P2. Now, obviously, this causes some huge problems and some huge discussions, especially across the course of social media, because there is a big discussion in regards to the likes of racial bias and things like that in regards to the FIA and things like that. And I think when we talk about this, we've got to be really open and honest with ourselves in the fact of what has happened for me. Because you look at the history of Formula One, Lewis Hamilton is the only black driver in history and has consistently been absolutely battered by the FIA. The championship stolen from him in 2021. There was a penalty in 2007, which I think cost him a penalty as well. 2008, ultimately probably could have lost that one because of the FIA, but didn't. And you look at the history of Lewis Hamilton and you go back and look at the penalties he's received. A lot of them are absolutely ridiculous. Now, the most annoying thing for me is when you look at like the documents from the FIA document sheet, you look at it and you go back to Hungary, Lewis Hamilton and Max Verstappen in Hungary. I think it was last year when he was still in Mercedes. Max Verstappen locks up the brakes and smashes into Hamilton's front wheel. But it's Hamilton that could have done more to avoid the collision. Yet again, yesterday, it's Hamilton that should have done more to avoid Max Verstappen. Like, for me, these are things that are so wrong with Formula One and with the FIA. And I just don't know how we're ever going to deal with it. I'm not going to lie, because the FIA is ultimately corrupt at the moment. Ben Sulayem doesn't like Lewis Hamilton. We know that for a fact. Ben Sulayem is pretty much a dickhead. And ultimately, there are all sorts of problems that we have. Now, obviously, the main positive to come out of the Mexico Grand Prix is that it finished. That is the best thing that came out of the Mexico Grand Prix. There's so many different things we could talk about. I could go on for days about penalties, about the lack of consistency from the FIA, the way the rules don't actually work. But ultimately, I'd just be wasting my breath. Now, obviously, you can let me know your thoughts on this down in the comments. If you have not done so already, let me know your thoughts down below. Hit that like button, hit that subscribe button, and turn on that notification bell. And I'll catch you in the next one. Bye-bye, guys.